This video is an excerpt from an interview that I did with Ocean Geographic about some of my favourite competition shots from the major wildlife photography competitions. I run through, I think, 10 pictures talking about why I entered them, why perhaps they were successful, and a little bit of the backstory about how I took them. I hope you enjoyed. This is the first picture that I had awarded in the wildlife photographer, the first picture I took that was awarded in the wildlife photographer. This is a picture of a pair of shy hamlets spawning in the Caribbean, taken at sunset. And this picture, this is probably, of all the pictures I've had awarded in the wildlife photographer, this is probably the one that was most calculated in terms of being a picture that I thought could do well. I took this picture, I think in 2003 or 2004, but I'd started working on the hamlets about 3 or 4 years before that. And when I was still working as a scientist, I'd read a scientific paper describing the spawning behavior, and hamlets are a fascinating species, and I'll try not to talk too long about them, but there's basically 10 different color types in the Caribbean. And those color types, when they actually look at the genetics of them, they're actually not, there's no genetic distinction between them. They're very much thought of by the scientists as being right in the middle of evolving into separate species. And the mechanism by which they're separating is when they spawn, they like to spawn with the same color type. And each time they do that, they take a step closer to being a separate species. And when they hybridize, they take a step back. And no one's really sure whether they will end up as separate species or they'll end up mixed up again. But they're fascinating from that point of view. But they're also really interesting because they're one of the few vertebrate species that are true simultaneous hermaphrodites. We're quite used to a lot of coral reef fish changing sex during their lives. A lot of wrasses and parrotfish, they start off as females and they become males. Anemone fish start off as males and become females. And that's quite common. But the hamlets actually remain active as male and female as adults. And so when they spawn, they have this weird spawning behavior where they spawn one way round, as one acting as the male, one acting as the female, and then they stop, and then about a minute later they spawn the other way round, and sometimes they swap 2 or 3 times during the night, during their spawning session. So they're really interesting to watch. And so I felt this was a really interesting story that I wanted to tell. The scientists had already photographed them in the aquarium, so I knew that there was a visually an interesting shot to get, and that got me into wanting to photograph this species. And having sort of built, I ended up by this shot by working out not only to capture the behavior and how to see it, but I realized that to get my winning shot, I had to photograph the prettiest species. And I felt that the shy hamlet was the prettiest, had lovely yellow color to it. And then it was all about the pose. And you can't really control what pose you're going to get when they're spawning. It just depends which way they face. But if you spend enough time with them, the angle where the male comes onto the camera, because the male yawns when he's spawning, and that angle was the one I wanted. So I kind of knew if I could get all this together, it was something fresh and new in underwater photography, and it had a really good chance of being a competition success. And when I took this picture on the boat, I actually said to someone on the boat, I reckon I can win in the wildlife photographer with this shot. Like, I'm
nice.
Joking.
You know he's a keeper straight away.
You're like, yes. Got it.
Yeah, and I'd shot them lots before, but it was just when I got this species, and it was actually quite logistically difficult for me to get, because at that stage of my career I didn't have very good contacts, I didn't know many people, and they spawn at dusk, and in the Cayman Islands where I was, they were hard to access at dusk because they're spawning out on the reefs, and most dive boats either dive during the day or they dive at night. And the only way I could go and dive with them was to find a dive operator that went out really early for night dives. And then they would let me jump in early before the night dive so that I could do this. And so this was actually taken on like a standard tourist night dive. And I persuaded them to let me go in when they turned up on the dive site to do their long briefing about how to night dive. And I popped in early and got this shot. So, obviously these days I have better contacts to be able to get more access.
Okay.
So that's kind of what I was going to run through. I'll maybe not speak quite so long about the others.
Okay.
That's really cool, though. I love that. That's a great story.
Wow. Okay.
Oh.
So this photo is kind of where that type of photography has gone. This is a photo that I took in 2018, and I took this picture, won the underwater category in the biggest Spanish nature photography competition last year, the Mont Photo Contest, which is a really, it's kind of like the Spanish version of the wildlife photography I've been running a long time, and has a lot of the same photographers doing well in it. The Spanish photographers tend to dominate very strongly anyway in the wildlife photographer. And this picture here, I really wanted to show this picture because for me, it's an amazing image that I took. It involved a huge amount of luck to get this particular shot. I was photographing these surgeonfish. They're yellowtail surgeonfish. They're endemic to the Red Sea. And I photographed them courting. And I was never really intending to get a spawning shot of them because when they spawn, they swim as fast as they can up from the reef and split apart. And I never ever thought I'd get a shot of it. And this shot was a complete fluke. I was trying to get this shot, but they just happened to swim into focus right at the moment they were spawning. And what I'd never realized before getting this shot is actually when they spawn, they flip over and they go belly to belly. And they just happen, and I just happen to get them. And this picture isn't a long exposure. It's just the fish are swimming so fast that there's all this blur around them. I think the picture is like a 60th of a second, but the fish were just going so far. So it's a photo that, you know, owes a lot to luck, as a lot of competition shots do. But I know it's unique, and I know this picture will be unique for the rest of my life. I'll never take another one like it. No one else, I'm sure, will. Just because it's just complete, you know, they just happen to be in focus, and I happen to press the shutter, not ever expecting to get it.
Right.
Yeah, this actually was, I took this one on when I was running a Red Sea workshop, and I'd organized, we'd gone to a place that was really, really good for shooting split level shots at sunset. And all the group were doing that. And I'd been to that place like, you know, 20 times to shoot sunset shots. And I was like, right, I'm going to go and do something else because I can't
I'm done
face photographing the same corals again with the same sunset. There's no clouds in the Red Sea. The sunset's the same every night. So I went and did this, just diving on like a rubbly reef underneath the mooring of the boats
How fun.
near Sharm el-Sheikh and photographed these. So, yeah. Right. Next picture. I think one of the things that when we have success in competitions as photographers, we like to sort of analyze and understand why those pictures were successful. And certainly something that comes up a lot in some of my awarded shots in these major competitions is that those shots have some sort of technical novelty to them, either in terms of using new equipment that's just coming out and enabling me to take new types of pictures, or me trying to take different styles of shots that are kind of pushing boundaries. And these next few images all have something new in terms of the equipment I was using for them that just made that shot a little bit special. Now, I think one thing that's really important to be clear about is the judges couldn't care less what camera you took the picture with, as long as the quality is good enough. And they, in none of these situations would the judges have been aware that the picture was taken with any sort of new technology. The pictures are appealing to them because that use of that new technology has enabled me to take a picture that just moves the game on in that style of shot a little bit. And this picture here is a relatively simple idea. It's a silhouette shot of a whale shark, but it's the detail of this shot that I think makes it really stand out, in that everything was absolutely right. This is a young whale shark in Isla Mujeres in Mexico. And it was photographed, taken as a silhouette early one morning. And the main thing that I wanted to achieve with this shot was to get this lovely silhouette. But the key thing was to wait to get a whale shark coming in exactly the direction I wanted. So I found the angle where the sun was right at the base of Snell's window. It was early in the morning, lovely calm morning, so really nice sun rays. The wind hadn't got up. But I really wanted to wait for a shark to be coming exactly out of the sun to get this light effect. And the only way I could do that really was once I saw a shark, was swimming like mad to get in position so that the shark would come directly out of the sun, so that all the perfection of the sunbeams being exactly symmetrical around the shark. Obviously there's a lot of symmetry in the body shape of the shark. Those things I think really add to the graphic strength of this image. And the piece of equipment that really made a difference for me in this case was using a really small camera. A lot of the times as underwater photographers, as we get better and better at underwater photography, our cameras get bigger and bigger and bigger.
Right.
And the year I took this, this was taken in 2012, the first Micro Four Thirds mirrorless cameras had come out that were really good. And this was taken with what was then the best Micro Four Thirds mirrorless camera, an Olympus OMD EM5, which was, I think a lot of underwater photographers, it really made them embrace mirrorless and particularly Micro Four Thirds shooting.
Definitely.
And it meant that I had a really high quality camera that was really small. And I'm sure Michael remembers the days when, you know, as a shooting film, we could grab a Nikonos 5 and have a really small little camera that was really high quality. And at times that was the right tool for the job. And we've never really had that in the digital era, but actually these cameras, that's what I was using this camera for. So I had this really small camera that meant I was really maneuverable in the water. I could really get myself in exactly the position I wanted to. And the camera had enough image quality to be able to capture the shot. So that was a really important aspect to me being able to get exactly the composition I wanted for this shot.
I love the water movement in front of its face too. That's such a cool detail. It's just, it's beautiful.
Can I ask, is this a converted from black and white, or is this color and just the time of the morning with very little color?
No, it's a black and white, and it was awarded in black and white category.
Okay.
At the Wildlife Photographer. And so, yeah, it's a black and white. I actually prefer this picture as a color shot in many ways. Although it's better known as a black and white shot, it's actually one of those nice ones. Quite often you find with the competition shots, they're not necessarily your most commercial shots. They don't tend to sell very well for editorial usage. They certainly, the fish spawning stuff, hardly anyone ever buys that. But the color version of this does very well as a selling shot. But the black and white version never sells.
And I love that little remora off to the side. Sometimes it's those funny little details,
Yeah, and that's certainly something like of the wildlife photographer, when they print up the big prints for the main exhibition, that hundreds of thousands of people go and visit almost every week. It's hugely popular, the London version.
Yeah.
I mean, it travels around the world too. People really spend time with the images and really look into the details. And it's one of the lessons is you can get away with, as a photographer, with really small subjects in the frame, and the pictures can still work really well, but also everyone really sees all the details in your shot. And so that's very much in that sense. This next one is also from the Wildlife Photographer.
Oh yes, I love this one. I love this. I remember the shot. This is quite recent, wasn't it? This is quite recent.
Yeah, it was about. I don't remember the year, but I took this picture in 2015. So I guess it was awarded 2016, because I took this picture on the trip when my wife found out she was pregnant at home, and my daughter was born in 2016. So
cool.
I always remember the trip for that reason.
Yeah.
And this is one where this was taken using a special optic for the wide angle lens that allowed me to shoot my rectilinear lens, my wide angle lens, at a wider aperture than normal, which in a very dark environment underneath the wreck, not underneath the wreck. So this picture, to go back to the beginning, is a picture of a cormorant hunting Pacific chub mackerel, which are aggregated under an oil rig off Los Angeles. And there's a couple of rigs out off LA where they allow you to dive under them, with permission. And it's a really, really amazing diving experience. When it's swelly and the current's running, and it's quite an intimidating place to dive because you're really in the middle of the ocean. And when you get near the edges of the rig, the current really starts to pull. And I was wearing a dry suit, so you're not as fast in the water as when you're wearing a wetsuit and everything like that. But it was a fascinating environment. The legs are covered in life and color. And then there's all sorts of pelagic stuff going on there. The fish aggregate there because they're actually protected from fishing, because you can't fish around the rigs. So it's a really interesting ecosystem. And I wanted to tell that story of the natural history story of the cormorant hunting, but also have the rig as part of the picture, not just make it about, fish and a cormorant, which we'd seen lots of times before. And this is an example of also being aware that the subject doesn't necessarily need to be really big in the frame for the picture to work. And I think that, you know, it's a lesson that the generation who's used to showing people pictures on phones is always wants the subject to be as big as possible in the picture.
Right.
And actually, you know, people don't always look at pictures tiny on a phone. They often see them big. And those pictures that work very well when they're seen small like that often become a bit boring when they're bigger. And a picture with a bit more space, a bit more to enjoy. So I think those are some of the reasons this picture was successful. And this picture almost won the category. The judges told me they were split on the judging. But in those days, it's just a. But anyway, it's not a big deal for me. For me, my goal in that contest is to be awarded as often as possible, as opposed to always, you know, I'm very happy just to regularly feature and be sort of part of the scenery there, rather than
that
be
makes
a big
sense.
winner. And then you have a very stressful awards ceremony at the wildlife photographer if you're a category winner, because you might be the overall winner. Can't get too drunk, whereas I could just anyway,
good one.
the key technical thing on this was I wanted the legs of I'd shot this already with a fisheye and had a really nice fisheye shot, but the bendy legs were an issue, the legs of the oil rig. And so I decided to go and shoot it with a rectilinear wide angle lens. But because it was so dark underwater, I wanted to keep the detail into the corners because I knew the fish were going into the corners of the frame. And I'd actually personally had developed or I don't know, it's not quite the right word. I'd adopted this old underwater optic made by Carl Zeiss for Hasselblad. And I'd sort of re-engineered it to be able to use it on my SLR. And so this was a really nice sort of reward for me for all that hard work of trying to get this lens to work. And I'd done a lot of testing to get it all set up right and everything like that. And then this was a really great opportunity to use it when, if I'd had to shoot this with a dome port, it would have been really hard to get those corners sharp in the amount of light that was down there. And because it was so dark underneath the rig. So the technology allowed, and I think, you know, 5 years ago, the camera's ISOs wouldn't have been a deal with this. The optics wouldn't have been able to deal with it. And so that's why a shot like this has sort of been undiscovered. And in 5 years' time, it'd be relatively easy with camera technology for people to take a shot like this. So it was kind of, the technology allowed me to create a fresher image at that time.
Very neat.
And this picture here is one that's in the current exhibition at the Wildlife Photographer.
Yep, it is.
And it's a relatively
it's right now in Sydney at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah,
that's
and
right, yeah.
you probably saw it when you were in the museum doing the judging this year as well.
Yes.
And it's a picture that, you know, on a phone looks, nice. But the bigger it gets, the better it gets, because it's packed with really interesting detail. Just the way the light from the strobes and particularly from the sun is just reflecting on the different fish. This picture has sold so many prints, the museum told me, because people just love it. You know, I think black and white pictures, people often feel a bit better for their walls than color pictures, and the museum sells prints from the exhibition. And I think particularly when you see it really printed really big, it really works. And this was taken when I was working with Nauticam on their new wide angle corrector port, which is another wide angle optic. And I was doing some late testing on a pre-production unit. It was the final design, but it wasn't a commercial unit yet. And I took it on to the Red Sea to do some shooting with it. And this was taken with that. So it's also really nice when you work with manufacturers to help create a new piece of equipment and you're able to have some success with it. You know, obviously the judges would have no idea about that. They would just reacting to the image as a visual image. But I think the fact that I had that sort of new technology on my side allowed me to produce a picture like this with a better image quality, you know, slightly, good sharpness right to the edges of the frame, you know, real detail in the picture. And I think those factors maybe help a little bit. And the same is true of the next one. This is Nembroth nudibranch, and this is for me a very standard shot. But this was awarded in the wildlife photographer probably 5-6 years ago. And this picture was used a huge amount in like their publicity. It was on banners all around the world. It was on invitations. It was on, it was just used again and again and again. And these days, I probably wouldn't show it in a normal talk. You know, it's a nice shot. It's a well-known shot, but it's, you know, lots of underwater photographers have very similar nudibranch shots. But at the time I took this, I think it was still relatively fresh. And that's because the explosion in super macro capabilities in underwater photography hadn't really happened yet, because the gear that we now all consider, you know, it's in everyone's gear bag, hadn't come out. And this was taken with a prototype of what became Nauticam's SMC close-up lens, which was one of the sharpest high-resolution options out there. And obviously in the wildlife photographer, they check all the raw files. So, well, lots of people have a shot like this. You know, this is shot like this, but, you know, it's not cropped or adjusted, you know, at all. So the raw file looks exactly like this. And I think I was able to get that and get the really great image quality right out into the corners of the frame on the rhinophores because of the new equipment. And I think that enabled this shot, although I think from an underwater perspective is nothing super special. I think it really appealed to those judges. And the other point I wanted to make with this shot was to say that with a competition like the wildlife photographer, some years, as this year, you had an underwater judge on the panel, but quite often they don't have an underwater judge on the panel. So there's room to enter pictures that maybe if you had a bunch of underwater photographers, they'd say, oh yeah, we've seen that type of thing before. I think when you have a bunch of non-underwater photographers, you know, they don't know what's rare, what's common necessarily that well. So, you know, you want to base it more around visual appeal. And for me, I was thrilled to be able to tell the story of nudibranchs to that audience, you know, and, you know, the caption we did for this one was all about, you know, how nudibranchs are what they eat, and, you know, Nembrothas, they eat sea squirts, they get toxins from the sea squirt, they secrete them into the pustules around their body. They have these bright poster colors to advertise the fact that they're distasteful. You know, the contrast between the orange and the green is a big part of how it's able to survive. And actually the orange pigments in these are fluorescent. So you don't need a flash gun to see them at depth. If you photograph one of these in available light, you still see the orange because the orange is actually a fluorescent pigment. So it's generating that orange at depth. So all those factors kind of, it was really nice to be able to tell, yes, it's a slug, but there's a lot more to it than that. And it's not always, it has to be about the big animals. Right. Where am I? Right. Number 7. And this is this is an older picture of mine from the wildlife photographer that is probably the best known one of mine from the wildlife photographer, partly because it's one of the older ones, but it was also a really, really well promoted one in the year that it won. It really, you know, it was in all the press, and it was, you know, used as an exhibition banner poster everywhere as well. Yeah. And this picture, I think, is one of the ones most dear to my heart, because I think I felt that it was a story. I think this is the one that really cemented to me how important it is to have the pictures you want in the competition. It's not just about this has got the best chance of winning. It's actually, this is the story I wanted to tell. And this is a picture taken in Egypt. This is a boha snapper. So this is a large predatory reef fish. You find them right across the Indo-Pacific. And they're usually solitary hunters, but they gather periodically, in some places once a month, some places twice a month, in other places just once or twice a year. They gather in large numbers to spawn. And this is a spawning aggregation in the Red Sea. And particularly in Palau, actually, you can see them spawning. In the Red Sea, they tend to spawn at night, and the area that they gather in is a marine park that doesn't allow diving at night, so you can't see them spawn there. But you can still see these amazing aggregations of fish, and it was a story I really wanted to tell. And it was a chance to to highlight a conservation issue with both a bit of carrot and a bit of stick, in that the Egyptians were doing a reasonable job of protecting this spawning aggregation. You know, there's a national park set up around them, but they weren't really policing the fishing that well. And so this was a great chance to tell the story of how important this spawning aggregation is for the future, to say, well done, Egypt, for setting up a marine park, but also to get the message out there that it's not always a perfect park and you need to do a better job with it. And actually, in recent years, the Egyptians now actually pay their fishermen to stay in port during the spawning season. So the fishermen are paid to stay in port, not go out and fish. Whereas for about 5 or 6 years after I took this picture, they were still going out there. The reason I feel that this picture did well is it offered a really, really fresh perspective on as an underwater picture. And this was a picture taken in the very early days of digital photography. I shot this with a D100 camera, so sort of right back at the beginning of decent digital cameras. And it was a picture where I realized what I could do where I was trying to exploit what was possible on digital that we couldn't do on film. And one of the problems you would have on film is if you shot a subject too far away, it was blue and it stayed blue forever. And what I became aware of, early in digital is that, yes, okay, we didn't have things like Lightroom. So you couldn't actually fix your white balance perfectly in post, but you could tune the white balance in the camera so that your pictures were great, look good out of the camera. So I set up this shot with my flash guns pushed probably about 2 feet, 67 centimeters in front of my lens. Wow. So that I could get light on this subject while shooting it from a relative distance. It was a technique sort of I later, shared and called telephoto photography. But at the time, I was just trying to solve the problem of lighting a subject that was relatively far away. And it's shot very much like someone might photograph a bird or something on land with a telephoto lens, forcing the perspective, putting the background out of focus, but also kind of pulling it closer. Right. And I think that this picture appealed to the judges. It's got great character in the individual fish, but it's the background that makes the picture. And it's a very unusual perspective for an underwater picture. And I think it's it also gets used a lot in a lot of the collection books that the wildlife photographer publishes, which is a great measure that the picture has aged well, that they still want to keep using it and putting it out there. Yeah. And I think the lesson for me from this was that if you can, if you are able to break some ground technologically, you can have an awarded picture, even with what is basically a not rare, not particularly charismatic subject. But if you can make it so in your picture, it can really stand out. So that's kind of what I learned from this one.
That's a great one.
The last couple. This is, so I've got 2 or 3 left. This picture is a coral spawning shot taken in the Caribbean. And this was awarded in the European Wildlife Photographer Competition, which is, it's a competition, it's kind of the German version of the Wildlife Photographer. It's called the GDT, European Wildlife Photographer of the Year. And it's open only to European photographers or people who join their society. So it doesn't have as big an entry as the wildlife photographer, but actually it has a huge overlap with the winners from the wildlife photographer because the 2 competitions run at the same time. A lot of the photographers choose to enter the same pictures in both competitions at the same time. And a lot of the category winners from the wildlife photographer last year were category winners in the GDT this year, last year as well. So personally though, I don't do that. And I often feel I'm one of the few photographers who takes this approach. I don't sort of agree with spamming competitions with my pictures. I have a rule that I've always adhered to, that once a picture has won a competition, even if it's a highly commended in a relatively minor competition, I won't enter it anywhere else. It's retired from competitions at that point. And the reason I do that is I think for me, I want my photography, I want to be known as a photographer who can shoot lots of different subjects, wide angle, macro, cold water, tropical, creative, natural history, behavior. I want to be known to have that width of ability, not just be a photographer who wins lots of prizes with basically the same shot or similar shots. Right. The same. So I've always sort of, once something's won, it's retired. And this is a picture that I'd really sort of almost kind of regret that I put it in GDT, because it's not, I think I wished I'd have saved it for the wildlife photographer, just because it's one of my favorite pictures, because I think for me, it's one of the purest wildlife photography shots that I've done, in terms of, I actually worked out when these corals would spawn. I did those calculations back in 2003 when I was working as a scientist. And we actually did the first ever observations of mass coral spawning in the Cayman Islands, where I did the calculations for, and then took some pictures, and then over the years, and then went back, I think in 2012, maybe 2013, to take this shot, where I used my own calculations to predict the spawning of the thing, and then went down and set up a remote strobe, waited for the coral to be about to spawn, and then was able to create this, fairly unique backlit coral spawning picture. And I think I poured so much of myself into this shot, using an unusual technique, using, calculations to figure things out.
Right.
That, I kind of, the GDT is I think the competition that a lot of the photographers look at first, because it's often artistically a little bit more breaking new ground than the wildlife photographer, but the wildlife photographer gets more international press coverage. So
right.
I'd love to have told this story to an even bigger audience, just because I'm so proud of this particular shot.
Yeah.
But maybe visually it takes a bit of getting, because it's a mess.
It's a lovely picture. It's the great storytelling, and it's the moment, and I think it's a lot of planning going to getting this shot. It's not easy.
Oh yeah.
I've seen so many spawning pictures, but it's the one with the best I've ever seen.
Yeah, no, I'm really, proud of these shots, and so I'd love to actually do more of this, and I'd
yeah.
I know it's not doing particularly well at the moment, the Great Barrier Reef, but I'd love to visit there and shoot spawning. I never had the chance to do that.
That would be great. Yeah.
It's almost like it's on land. It's like a storm.
Yeah. I think it looks a little bit like a starry sky or something like that.
It does. Yep, absolutely.
Mountain star coral.
Yep, that's what I thought.
Yeah,
that's cool. Love that.
Right.
Very neat.
And then the last couple are just a couple of shots. This was actually awarded the same year as the coral in GDT, and taken maybe on the same trip as well. I don't remember. And this is a hunting predation shot taken of these barjacks hunting silversides, and just made that little bit more interesting than normal by the use of a long exposure, which you can see at the top of the frame. It's turned the silversides into spaghetti, and I think that's quite. I like that movement and that effect. And I've done a lot of similar shots like this, but this was I really like those three fish and just the whole balance of the composition. But I think it's that little twist of using a long exposure that probably made this a little bit more, have a little stronger visual appeal, and probably stand out from other shots of similar subject matter that I'm sure would have been in the contest from other photographers. So you don't always necessarily, when you're trying to be creative and create these images that stand out from other people, you don't need to completely reinvent the wheel. It's often just a case of, just pumping the tires up a little bit more, maybe having slightly better tires than someone else. It's just those little differences that can often make people stand out. And that's why I think with some of the technology I've used down the years, when new stuff comes along, using that to take pictures that, maybe take a small step forward in that area, or using techniques that just give your work just a slight differentiation from others. And often the judges won't necessarily say it's because of that. They'll just say, I love it and it feels fresh, therefore we want to award it. It's not always such a thing. And then the final shot is this photo.
That one's amazing.
It's the overall winner from the GDT European Wildlife Photography.
Makes sense.
In 2013. And it's a picture that I don't think has ever sold. It's not commercially got any value at all. I don't show it often in slideshows because it takes too long to explain what it is. So it's not normally a picture that I get much use out of.
Too bad.
But it was, I think it was a picture that I took. I was driven to take it, not because I was trying to take a competition shot, but I was driven by a curiosity to experiment with the techniques and trying to make them work. And the photo is of a sponge on a coral reef with and I put light behind it, and then it's a long exposure of that scene as fish came in to hunt. The light attracted zooplankton, the zooplankton attracted small bait fish, and then the bait fish attracted jacks, and it's the trails of the jacks generally see in the picture.
So how long exposure was this?
I think this one, I should have looked it up. I think it was an 8-second one, this one.
Okay,
But on that evening, I was just experimenting and playing.
Oh, darn cool.
And I was very limited because I went to a shallow patch reef to do this, so that I could find reefs surrounded by sand where I could put the tripod.
Exactly.
And the problem with that dive site was that actually the sponges there, or the topography, was very unattractive. And there were some quite nice wavy sea fans, but they were blurring too much in my photos. So the only thing I had was this very boring gray spot as a sort of foreground. And I always really was frustrated by that at the time. And I didn't think I was interested by what I was getting, but I kind of thought this was a stepping stone towards a better shot.
Yeah.
But I was trying to figure out how I could find a better foreground in a place where I could put a tripod down. And so, and I think, you know, and this is a picture that I would say from a competition point of view, you could enter this in 10 competitions and 9 times out of 10, it would go out in the first round. And I think that's something you could say with a lot of pictures that do, you know, that end up being overall winners. They can be real opinion splitters and I think often pictures that can go all the way in competitions almost need to be a little bit like that sometimes, in that they've got to be something that people are either going to fall totally in love with or just go, oh my God, not at all for me.
Right.
You know, and I understand that. And actually, after I took this picture, I didn't enter it in the competition for a couple of years.
Really?
I took this picture in January 2012, and it was awarded in 2013 October. And the reason was I came back from the trip, and I sent the picture to a photo editor who was a good friend of mine. You know, she worked for a magazine I was working with, and I said, you know, here are some of my latest pictures. What do you think? And I was like, I'm really excited by this. And she was like, no, not at all, because she was very much thinking with an editorial hat on, going, you know, I can't use that picture for anything. And it kind of made me lose my confidence in it a bit. So I didn't enter it for a while, and then entered it the following year. But probably, you know, another year, a different set of judges, it wouldn't have got anything anyway. So it was all serendipitous for the success. But I really like it because I think when you do win big in a competition, whether it's, you know, getting your first wildlife photographer thing, you want it to be with the right shot. And what I was really proud about this shot, and it won really big for me, was that I'd never seen another underwater photo like it. It felt like I'd done something that was really, really original and different. Absolutely. So when it did get all the praise and all the publicity to it, you know, it's not like I'd won with, you know, a version of a picture of a clownfish that everyone's got and they just happened to like it that year. I'd won with something that was, you know, only I'd done this shot at that time, and it felt really fresh. I hadn't really shared it much on social media because I didn't have a lot of confidence in it. And then once I knew it had won, I obviously kept it very much under wraps for the rest of the year. And so when it did come out, it felt really fresh. And I think that's something that I would take away from the contest. There's nothing better than winning with a picture that people have never seen. You know, when I remember when you know, so when you get these shots, you know, yes, you can spam them in, or you can, sorry, it's the wrong word, but you can put them in every competition out there and you know, pick up loads of prizes. But there's nothing better than winning really big with a shot that's no one has seen before, and you just like, bang, there it is. It's even better. Anyway, that's my 10. I've talked for ages.
I could listen forever, though. These are such great stories.
Your work is very inspiring, and